and I am our research director. I'm going to be talking about high amenity sites and also some of the changes to housing element law and how we can kind of move from those planning exercise type conversations to some concrete discussion of where we might want to see affordable homes developed. But first, take a moment to remember back to January 2018. Perfect by Ed Sheeran is at the top of the charts. Sorry to Bother You is showing in movie theaters. And new laws that are part of the 2017 housing package are going into effect. So if you think back to the housing package, you're probably thinking about Prop 1 and SB 2. You're thinking about a $4 billion housing bond passed by voters, a permanent source of affordable housing funding. But there were 13 other bills that were part of that historic package of legislation that tend to get a little bit less airtime. And they were addressing those streamlined approvals, that by right development, preservation, and a big chunk of them were about greater accountability for jurisdictions around their housing goals. So I'm going to talk about some of those less well-remembered changes and how we plan for and report on housing production, and then share some of the mapping CCRH has done in partnership with the UC Davis Center for Regional Change that can help inform our conversations around it. So there were three major categories of accountability and enforcement related bills. As part of the housing element process, right, all cities and counties are required to adequately plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in the community, and that includes anticipating population growth. That's done by creating their housing element as a part of their general plan. One of the key parts of the housing element process is identifying where housing could be built to meet housing need. So the 2017 housing package included several bills to try to strengthen that site selection process and make it so that housing elements always identify enough sites for potential development to meet the goals of housing production across all of the income categories. There was also a change made so that housing elements could only list land as a potential site to accommodate that housing development if it had a realistic capacity for development. That seems obvious, but I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat through where a new housing element in a jurisdiction comes out, some local business owner realizes the site of their shop has been identified somehow as a place for potential affordable housing development, and all of a sudden they're up in arms. They're worried the city's going to come, bulldoze their livelihood to put in affordable housing. And that's just because some planner was sitting back with some maps and thinking, maybe someday this could be zoned correctly. No relation to what's on the ground. The other piece about housing elements is that they're reviewed by the Department of Housing and Community Development. They're the only general plan element that has to be reviewed by the state. And one of the changes that came into effect in 2018 was that review process got some teeth because HCD could now refer violations of state law related to housing to the Attorney General. And there have been some cases that have moved forward in that way and through the Housing Accountability Act. So we had a Housing Accountability Act in place. It got strengthened to sort of place some limits around the ways that local jurisdictions were rejecting or downzoning proposed housing developments. So like Tom mentioned, those people came into public meetings, they were up in arms. I never want to live next to a renter in my life. It took away a little bit of communities' powers to block that development. And there have been some really interesting cases that have moved forward where community advocates have actually sued on behalf of the development under the Housing Accountability Act. So that's a lot of information I just threw at you. If you're still trying to furiously write it down so that you can make flashcards for later, don't worry, we're going to have these slides sent out. And what it boils down to is that thanks to that 2017 housing package, we have more funding than ever and more enforcement tools than ever to make sure our cities and counties are creating the affordable homes we need in the Valley. So how do we move from planning exercise to actual conversations with our electeds? How do we figure out where we want to build some housing, call Tom, see if self-help enterprises can put something down? How do we stay competitive? And how do we make sure, when we see sites being proposed in our housing element, what's the difference between saying, oh, this looks great versus, hey, maybe I should call the Attorney General? For any of those questions, what we want to look at is where amenities and resources are located and how our communities are zoned. So housing that's near amenities is more competitive for federal and state dollars. It improves health outcomes. It ultimately serves residents better and builds a better community at large. And that's why at CCRH, we undertook this project to map amenities across the San Joaquin Valley and really look at where housing was allowed and where the best places would be to develop affordable homes. So we took transit stop and station locations, public elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, grocery stores and supermarkets that are larger scale, more likely to sell healthy food, Mapped all of those, and then went through and gathered as much parcel level zoning data as we could to see where jurisdictions were zoning for residential development. And from there, we looked at the densities allowed, right? So really honing in on the high density sites where providing affordable housing sustainably for the most people possible would be most likely. We calculated each of those parcels' proximities to the amenities so that we had a map of high amenity sites zoned for high density residential development. And what we found was that places identified for affordable housing development were often too far from key amenities. So the housing element process where they're setting aside those sites wasn't really working. And the areas near amenities tended to be zoned for single family development or targeted for market rate housing. And this raises obvious concerns, right, about land use and equity. If zoning decisions keep making it difficult to develop affordable homes in the region's healthier neighborhoods, will perpetuate racial and class inequalities in income and health and life expectancy. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what the mapping tool actually looks like. It's available at that tiny URL up there. It's also on the CCRH website under the Publications tab. And for the sake of this panel, I'm going to show you some static images from it, but it's live on the web. So if you want to ignore me for the rest of this panel and go fool around with it, by all means. I've got an example here from Fresno. Just going to walk you through how some of this information layers together. And you can search for any location you want to look at with that search bar on the top left. So again, we looked at schools, grocery stores, and transit stops. You can look at each of those separately. As you'd expect, urban locations tend to have more densely concentrated resources. Here, for example, is all of the public schools surrounding Fresno. And here are all the parcels near those public schools. The blue are zoned for residential, and the yellow are zoned for non-residential. And just like the amenity location data, you can look at parcels near a type of amenity separately or see sites that are near all three kinds of amenities. And this example looks pretty good, right? There's lots of places we could build near schools in Fresno. But amenities are only half the picture of where we might want to locate affordable homes. And the other half is that zoning piece. So here's what residential densities allowed near Fresno look like. You've got your orange, lower density, single family homes, your green, medium density, and then those few small blue spots zoned for higher density. Giovanna mentioned one intersection where there was such a concentration of like farm worker housing and apartment buildings, right? It's these zoning patterns that are driving the creation of those intersections. And then when you combine that amenity location, the amenity data and the zoning, you see how limited our options are for locating high density multifamily housing near amenities. There's just these tiny little slivers of blue in some of those dots. Most of the land near amenities isn't even zoned for housing. It's that yellow stuff again, right? Here's another example. Here's Bakersfield, looking slightly better, slightly more dark blue. Some good candidates in Bakersfield. But unfortunately, when we look across the entire valley, only 8% of the parcels in the entire region are high amenity, and only 4% of those are zoned for higher housing density. So it's our hope that we can use these maps and the new tools in the housing element process to help shape community change on a jurisdictional level and on a site-by-site basis by supporting residents, supporting community-based groups, making sure that you guys have the same mapping tools, if not better ones than the staff are looking at, so that we can go talk to our developers about what parcels in our neighborhoods might be competitive for funding, might be a great choice for locating homes. And thanks to the Beefed Up Housing Accountability Act, it's less likely that proposed housing is going to be downzoned or denied. And then we can also help planners and decision makers as they consider changes to the zoning code, right? Can we change some of that green area into blue area and work with them to help them comply with these new housing element requirements and site identifications, so that we don't end up in this situation where, you know, you have lofty goals in your housing element, but realistically nothing new has been built. So it's great to be able to pick kind of those individual locations for future homes, but really we need to be thinking systematically about how to update our zoning practices and increasing our housing capacity throughout our communities to meet those targets and ensure everyone in the valley has a safe, stable, and affordable home. That's my quick pitch, and here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you're bringing these to your elected officials. We love hearing stories about how these work in action and how we can improve them for the next round.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you to all the panelists that shared today.